All right, everybody. Welcome in to another IAT SE Game Worker stream. This week is really special. Um, Today we've got Teri Hendrich from the Animation Guild here. Um, Teri, would you like to introduce yourself? Like, give us a little bit of background on what you do right now? Oh, wait, hold on.
Oh,
Okay.
oh,
I do this every time. I swear to God. I had you muted. You're good now, Teri. I'm so sorry. Go right ahead.
no worries. All right. Hey everyone. Yeah, I'm Terry, and I currently serve as Vice President of the Animation Guild. And I work in animation at the moment as a color supervisor, which that position manages the artists who work in the color department, from background painters to color designers. And I've been working in animation since 2007, but I didn't become a union member until like 20 I want to say 2011 or so. And yeah, I kind of just organically got more and more involved over the years, until like where I am today. I guess.
Yeah.
And besides also serving as the vice president, I chair one of our craft committees, which is the color design committee.
Could you just real quick just explain like what is your role as a VP of a local? By
Oh,
VP I mean vice president for anybody in the audience. I just want to make sure that I'm being
yeah.
clear with my I'm so used to acronyms at this point.
Yeah, so for the Animation Guild, so it's an elected role, that is voluntary. So like I don't get any extra compensation by serving as vice president. And really my number one responsibility is to essentially run a meeting if the president is not there to run the meeting, which actually just happened this past week.
Oh
And
wow.
yeah, the first time I had to run a general membership meeting. But that really is like my sole duty. And then, I mean, obviously, if so for some reason, if something happened to the president or they like resigned, I would automatically assume the role. So that's basically what I do. Yeah.
Wow. Um you're elected into that role, right?
Yes. So yeah, elected. Yeah, last time around, I think for our elections, I think most members were maybe like a little intimidated or not aware of like that they could get that involved with the union. So I mean, full disclosure, I ran unopposed, but so did I think every other elected position. So it was kind of like basically you have me because no one else like like volunteered.
Well, and I'll believe in my heart that you ran against 50 people and came out on top unanimously. Um, Also, hi to Maggie and Major Debauchery and Carlos in the chat. Glad to see y'all here. Um, but yeah, so I guess, I just wanted to learn more about what it meant to be like the VP of your local because I've not personally run an election or been in one yet to know like exactly what those roles end up being. Um, but you were also part of organizing in animation, right?
Yes. So this was around, I want to say 2017. And also worth noting at that time, the Animation Guild had no field representatives or organizers on staff. And around that time, kind of one of the big talking points in union meetings was like, hey, one of the most popular animated shows in town does not have a crew represented by the Animation Guild, which was BoJack Horseman. And it just so happened that I was employed at that same studio, which was Shadow Machine, on another union production. So it was like this mixed studio space of like one production which was represented by the Animation Guild, and then over here BoJack, which was not. And so it would kind of come up. Members would be like, "Hey, why don't we do something about this?" And I had newly volunteered to be a shop steward at the studio. So I took my role seriously of like, okay, I'm here to help represent the union. And there's people saying like, hey, let's organize BoJack, and I'm like, well, I'm sitting in the room right over from the BoJack crew. So I kind of just took it upon myself to like just kind of get the conversation going, and totally by the seat of my pants, because like as I said, there was no representative there to necessarily guide the conversation. And I knew I was friends and familiar with some of the crew members on BoJack, so like if whenever I found the opportunity, like if we were at an after hours event or like at a lunch, like somewhere obviously outside of the studio building, like I would just kind of casually bring up of like, hey, what do you think about getting like union benefits? Like, do you think you'd want to go through like that process? And yeah, it was really I guess invigorating to kind of see this kind of effort like organically grow, where like it's like, okay, like this one person was like, yeah, let's do it, and then they would talk to their friend and they're like, yeah, let's do it, and you could just see like the snowball happen. And like at a certain point, like I was no longer needed really. It was like they like kind of they had naturally found leaders for the effort, and like I was able to kind of step back and they kind of took over. And I think right like within weeks of my like already set end date on the production I had, like I wasn't like let go early or anything. Like I just naturally left the studio, and I think within like a matter of like 3 or 4 weeks that organizing effort had gone public. And like yeah.
So
and,
cool.
and
I
yeah,
remember
and
watching and seeing all that in the news and being just like, wow.
yeah, and it was something where like I think most people wouldn't have known that that wasn't a union show. Like I think what really made it kind of seem like, okay, so we need to fix this, is that the fact that the actors, like the voice actors and the writers on the show, were represented by their unions, but the animation artists were not. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like, hey, like let's address it, especially when the show had become so successful. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
How does it even happen that there's like a union show and a non-union show at a shop?
Yeah, that's kind of happened in the past where well, see, like studios basically create different company entities to hire people under.
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as that one entity is not part of the union, they can kind of do whatever they want. But if they are part of, signed to the union, then they would. I think in the case of the show I was on at Shadow Machine, it was being produced by a network that kind of required that it be represented by the union. So I think it wasn't necessarily the studio being like generous. It was kind of more like, okay, if you want this to do the job of producing the show, you need to make sure the crew is union. Whereas that was not the case with BoJack, which was being
I
produced
see.
for a different network.
What?
Yeah.
Um, I'm so
It,
glad that you were able to. Had you had any organizing experience before that?
no, yeah, I hadn't. Yeah, not myself. Yeah, that was all, I guess, new to me. And yeah, one thing I want to mention from that also kind of the after effect of that, because at that point in time, BoJack was already on its. They were producing the last season, and people didn't publicly know that, but internally, like the like leadership of the show, like already knew. So I know when the news of the union effort came out, there was kind of like, oh, like they went union and now the show's ending, and it was like, well, it was already in the works. And it kind of brings up the idea of like, well, then why did the artists even go through the effort of becoming union if it was already gonna, like, they were just months away of ending that, the work on the show. And something I knew would be true at the time, but what was hard to convey to those crew members was like, what you're doing now, it's gonna, reverberate and like create like a positive effect that will last beyond you, which was the case. So like, once they successfully were represented, after the fact, the studio Shadow Machine has gone on to produce now, like, I believe exclusively union shows. So like shows that I know would not have been union are now union because of what the BoJack crew was able to achieve.
Hell yeah. I love that. So much of organizing is about not necessarily the benefit you receive right now, but the benefit that goes on without you for people in the future. It's
Right.
it's not a temporary solution, it's a long-term solution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, and the fact that I can even sit here today as a union member is like, thanks to the Walt Disney's artists of the 1940s. Like,
Yeah.
they're the ones who kind of put in the effort, but it's lasted this long.
100%. Um, it's so awesome to hear about your experience organizing there. Because it sounds like it was also like a very different kind of experience too. Like you had all these people who were literally working in the same building as people who were union and getting different treatment than they were.
Right. So it was like just a glaring like inequity, which I think is a theme with me. It's like let no everyone needs to be on the same equal footing. Like,
Yeah. So you were a steward. Was that like the first kind of like union responsibility you had?
yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I also around that time is when I was getting involved with like our the Animation Guild's negotiate like master agreement negotiations, which is like the main contract that the big studios work under. So I had done that, and then I think then newly became like a steward, like within like a matter of months.
Cool. So you were like part of a negotiating committee for that master agreement and then became a steward?
Yes, yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the order of it.
Rad. Um, so talking about like negotiations, right? Um, I know the last time around we were talking a lot about the New Deal for animation. I was following that super closely because that was also happening kind of like at the same time as our organizing at Titmouse. Um, and there was a lot of like common concerns going on. But you were part of like the color design movement at that time. Can you talk a little bit about what that stemmed from and kind of like what exactly is a color designer? And let's start there. What exactly is a color designer? What is your job, Teri?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is actually I don't normally work as a color designer, but the job it's one of the positions that's in the design department, which is considered pre-production. It's we have to figure out what's a cartoon's going to look like, from like the characters to the backgrounds. So there's artists. I mean, it's kind of like an assembly line of like everyone has a specific task. There's the character designers doing the line art, the shape design of the characters, and then there's a prop designer, and then there's a background designer, and then there's a background painter, and then kind of the last step is the color designer, and the color designer is responsible for figuring out the color palettes for all the animated assets on screen, which would normally be like characters, props, and effects. And so when I first started in animation, I just had the perception of like all these jobs are equal. Like they're all design jobs. Like you can't really create a finished design without someone, doing their work.
Yeah.
And coincidentally, it was actually through that job I had at Shadow Machine where I realized, oh no, that's actually not the case, that of all those design positions I just listed, it is only the color design position which is paid the least. And at the time, it was about like the minimum was about a $300 difference per week, less, which like that's significant for. And so I'm like, what? Like when I learned that, I'm like, that makes no sense. Like why is this a thing? And because what I always want to emphasize, because like now it's been like years of us advocating about it. At that time, no one was talking about this. Like no one at union meetings that I was aware of was saying like, hey, did you know color designers are getting paid the least? Like it was just like an accepted thing of like, yeah, this is how it is. And but I'm like in my head I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like what's happening here? And coincidentally, I guess like this was around 2017, I guess, was a big year for me in like union kind of activity. That same year, the book by Mindy Johnson was published, which was Ink and Paint: The Women of Walt Disney's Animation. And when
Yes.
I heard the book title, I was like, oh, okay, I think I get what's happening here. Because at that time, when you look at the union contract, color design, which then was called color stylist, was under the ink and paint section. So I was like, oh, I think like this is a historically female dominated job that is experiencing, gender pay discrimination. But like, again, like no one was publicly saying that I was aware of. So it kind of just became like, to me, like this big issue of like, okay, if no one's talking about it, I guess I need to start talking about it. And that's kind of when I kind of just, again, by the seat of my pants, like found myself creating a committee, which was the color designer committee, and just kind of reaching out to other members who were working in the role. And it was interesting to talk to people, especially like veteran artists who had been doing color design work, who were women. Like their attitude was kind of like, yeah, I know I'm getting paid less, but also like this is a male dominated industry. Like, what's going to change? Like, this is how it is. Like it felt like they were just all like resigned. Like that was literally been their experience their entire career, was experiencing gender pay discrimination. So it's like, why would it suddenly change? So I feel like, I don't know. I like, I think it was unique for me since I was not necessarily working in that role, to kind of be the one to say like, no, like you can't just accept this. Like we got to stand up and make a change here. So that's kind of where kind of the more public advocacy for it came. We were actually like the first committee that I'm aware of within the Animation Guild that created like social media pages, and we also created a campaign starting back in 2018. If you saw the Color is Design campaign, that was us trying to just get people aware of like, hey, yeah, this is happening, this is a thing. And so over the years, through our contract negotiations, we've started to chip away at the inequities. Because another thing that was also very kind of like stark, I guess, was the fact that it wasn't just the pay that was like, it was like every single aspect of the like job, I don't know, benefits or structure was completely different from the design department, like the other design roles. Like, for example, it's very common to have a wage schedule of 1 year to reach journey. Like usually if you're working in a job for a year, you'll get your journey rate. But for that role, you needed to work 2 years. And like you're working 2 years to get to a lower rate than the rest of the design roles. Yeah. So it was just like inequity upon inequity upon inequity. And like we've had to like address every single one. Like another one was the fact that there was no kind of little asterisk saying that color design supervisors require 15% pay bump. So like my husband actually experienced that at a studio where he was legitimately doing color design supervising work, and he was getting paid not only the minimum as a color designer, but then, you know, less than other design artists who were not supervisors. So like just totally like
Yeah.
absolute inequity, which that's something we have luckily addressed in the 2022 negotiations.
Love that. Can we talk a bit about that? Like when you were negotiating for that, what ultimately became like a like, was it easy enough to say like, hey, we're designers, just give us the design rate? Like what was the kind of response slash pushback on it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, because like this whole endeavor has been like the underlying current is like we're combating discrimination. Like it's like how do you solve discrimination? Like basically, and of course, you know, the studios are sort of, you know, culprit number one in that department. I found that they kind of actively like being able to treat you know, employees differently. Like they like being able to give someone a perk and someone not. So when you tell them like, no, you shouldn't be doing that, it's like they're it's like they're offended or something. And
I
or like
can't
they're like,
have favorites? What?
or to them like that's not good business practice is to be equitable. Um and and especially like the number one kind of, I guess, obstacle for us with the color design kind of, you know, campaigning and everything is that we're up against like literally like a century of bias where like people have naturally assumed that this role is easy or less than, and like we've had, it's like breaking through all that kind of programming and being like, hey, no, actually that's not really the case. And then you're also in the position of like, you know, someone needs to like realize that they've been operating under like incorrect like information, like which is hard to accept. So I don't know, it's kind of all that wrapped into like, just can you just pay equally please? Like so
You
yeah,
know,
it's been an uphill battle, but we did get a kind of little bump in pay last time, but yeah, we're still dealing with a 200 pay gap per week inequity.
yeah. Um, it's kind of, and Major Debauchery, I'm gonna get to your question in just a second. It's wild to me that people would even think that color is less intensive than other facets of art when so many people, especially extremely talented artists, say, I don't know how to use color. Like, you know, like, I remember all in college, everybody always being like, can we get a color class? Can we get a color class? Um, and
Yeah, that's
people
something
never,
I brought that up as an argument is like when you're in art college, like, you know, you part of your tuition is like perspective class, figure drawing, color theory, and like those classes all cost you the same amount. Like it's not like one costs you less. Like they're all,
mm-mm,
the skills are valued the same at the college level. So yeah.
yeah. So Major Debauchery asks, question from what was said earlier. In video games, a lot of people are also employed by a third-party entity and are contracted out to AAA studios. If we were to organize, how do we avoid them from dragging their feet and getting stuck litigating who the worker is actually employed by and therefore who we're unionizing against? That's a great question. So what we would do is our homework, which is to find out all of that information. So who is writing your paychecks? Who is determining your working conditions? Like who wrote your handbook? Um, if it is the third party entity, then that is your employer. If it is the larger entity, then that's likely your employer. But determining that would need to be done through some research on both of our parts to get to the bottom of it. As an example, when we were at Titmouse, we were initially, I had thought we'd be negotiating with Titmouse, but we were hired through, again, a third-party entity, which was called Robin Redbreast. So technically, our agreement is not with Titmouse themselves; it is with their smaller company, or their secondary company, I guess, which is Robin Redbreast. So if you do go on the Animation Guild website and you try to find the Titmouse contract, you will only find the Robin Redbreast contract, because that's the only one that exists, at least for New York. There is a Titmouse LA contract for their production workers as well. But I hope that answers your question, Major Debauchery. If it doesn't, ask me again or for more clarification. But anyway, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I do have a story related to that, because my husband was also involved with the organizing of Rick and Morty. And at the time, that show had started at a studio called Starburns. And so when the animators or the artists got involved with organizing the show, they had put down on their organizing cards like that Starburns was their employer. And I think the effort really kicked off the second season. And by that season, it had actually changed. Like their technical employer was like Rick and Morty LLC. So they had all the cards did not have the correct employer written on them. And I think so when they presented the effort, like, presented the, I guess like a card checker, they, the studio was like, oh, well, you have the incorrect employer, like we're rejecting this. And I think because of that, what they said, they did an immediate walkout. To say like, no, this is like, oh, like it's just like, no, this is really happening. And but then I remember that being like a pretty quick thing. Like they walked out the building, and I think within the same day they like walked back in and they were union.
Yeah, it's not like getting a parking ticket where if they get one letter wrong on your license plate, you get off scot-free. You know what I mean? Like, there is some information that we need, and if it's, we'll do our best to make sure that we get it right. But in that particular case, it is a bit ridiculous to be like, well, technically, someone else. So all these cards aren't valid. Your unionizing effort is not valid. That's a really interesting thing. Was that for the entire production itself?
Yeah. I remember that effort. Yeah, it was everyone, like even the writers also became represented by TAG at the time.
Wow. Because I know the production workers then were separate and more recent, right?
Yeah, because for a long time, production workers in animation where the jurisdiction was for a different local. So when I was organized or helping to organize BoJack, there were production members who were like, oh, can I join this? And it was kind of like a question mark. And at the time, the jurisdiction had not been given to 839. So unfortunately, they were not able to participate at that time, but they have since been able to organize and are now union.
Yeah, which is awesome. So everybody should be union. So yeah, we've talked a bit about like the history of ink and paint and the gender disparity, which, again, is another topic that's near and dear to my heart, is equality. Well, oh my god, why am I forgetting the other word? Oh my god, equity. But you're up for negotiation again now. What do you think is the biggest reason that it's important, especially now, for us to revisit issues that we've already negotiated?
Like, are you talking about kind of, I don't know, like historical issues or long-standing issues?
So what I'm getting at is like, why is it important for us to renegotiate these contracts? Why can't we? What happened? Why don't we just get it right the first time?
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I like to view the union contracts as a living document. So it kind of gets molded over time. And, as, the ways of production change and technology changes, like the contract does need to be updated to reflect that. Otherwise, you potentially are no longer covered by the union. That was actually a big thing with when streaming came onto the scene, because there was nothing in the contract that said that doing work for streaming would be like automatically be covered. Like we actually had to negotiate for that. So if we didn't negotiate it for it, then you would no longer have union benefits working on a streaming production. But the struggle has always been to like get to what the union ideal is, versus what we've had to settle for in a contract, because negotiations are always finding the middle ground. So like I mean, the common like phrase is like no one really leaves 100% happy, because like you have to compromise and like meet in the middle. But the hope is that through revisiting the contract in succeeding negotiations, you'll start to kind of move like closer and close, like move the needle closer to where you originally wanted to go. But it definitely is, it takes patience, and like it's definitely a long game. Like you have to be willing to run a marathon to kind of see real kind of change happen.
Yeah, definitely. Thinking about how we negotiated our first contract at Titmouse, and how we could potentially improve upon it next time, or the things that we found out that are necessary for next time, is huge. We inked our document, we ratified it right before AI came on the scene. So that's definitely something that I'm sure the next round would want to address. But, things change over time. Needs change over time. Inflation, like you have a 1 year where it's 12%, and then all of a sudden you find out that pay isn't going as far as it was before. So making sure that you're keeping that document, again, like as you said, as a living document, so that it can keep up with times that constantly change, is super important. And I think that is especially important for folks. I mean, it's especially important for everybody, but it's very applicable to folks who work in games, considering that so much of the technology changes all the time. And again, like the needs of the workers change. So a lot of game workers I know are still remote. Some are being forced back to work. And if you were living in Wisconsin and now you have to go live in Irvine, California, your needs change a lot with that. And maybe your boss is not amenable to giving you that giant pay jump that you'll need to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment in Irvine. So it's things that constantly need to be addressed as they change. But also, kind of going back to like equity, inclusion in video games, like I feel like games are also like a very male dominated industry. I had trouble finding like the most common role for women in games, but if anybody has that information, please share it with me. I'd love to know. And also who has that information, because I'd love to find out what other things they dug up.
I mean, you can just guess that it's likely one of the lower paying roles that, that's where women end up.
But like kind of what you were talking about with color design workers is like addressing that in contract negotiations, even though we're not necessarily calling it the gender equity proposal. We're saying that something's wrong here and we need to fix it, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, publicly we do say like, yeah, this is about gender pay equity. Um, Although that is, yeah, one of the tricky things with negotiations is when you're talking to the employers, like everything's on the record. So when we're talking about something that essentially is a legal issue, like they don't want to basically like say anything that will cause them to essentially admit guilt. So they kind of like don't even want to address the issue in the terms of what it is. Like they don't want to talk about it as this is discrimination. So we do have to come at it from like, look, this uh, role is doing substantially similar work. You're underpaying, like, you know, you're not keeping quality artists in the job because you're not paying them like you are everyone else, and trying to kind of make the point that way.
Yeah. Um, it is important to meet them where they're at with that, you know? Um, Alina Staton
Yeah.
says that most workers who are women are writers and artists, which makes a lot of sense. And then Maggie also shares that most of the game workers she knows are producers who are women. Um, Production is another like highly um, women
Yeah.
concentrated
Um,
area, right?
yeah, well, like the live action local that represents production staff is like they also have like a pay equity campaign. Um, so it honestly it is a bit of a question mark of like the production staff in animation. Because I've been able to get the data from the office of like what the demographics they have, but at the time they were able to pull that, production was still in the infancy of becoming represented by the union, so we just didn't have that data.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would it would not surprise me if we find that it actually is also female dominated, at least some of those roles.
Um, Also, shout out to Ben Spate in the chat. Appreciate you. Um, but also, you know, I used to be a part of Women in Animation as well, and a lot of studies that we did with USC Annenberg found that a lot of women in working in animation were in production roles. Um, and when we were organizing at Titmouse, production roles were also the least paid. Um, Regardless of how high up you got. I mean, of course, the executive producer's different story, but I'm talking about like line producer, production manager, production coordinators, production assistants.
Yeah, I don't know if this is like bad to say, but I kind of hope we do discover that potentially more like crafts or positions are experiencing this, because it is definitely hard to get people on board when it's just focused on one job or one craft, because then it's kind of like, well, why do we have to care about you? But once it's a bigger of like, no, actually it's affecting not like this job and this job. We just haven't we just haven't had the data to be able to say that.
Yeah. And I think that that's a huge opportunity here for folks in games is like, that's why we want everybody at a studio all together all at once. So that we don't find these pockets of people who are severely neglected and then
Right.
don't
Yeah.
have those protections as well.
Yeah, and I think that's also like kind of an important point of like you want everyone kind of in this effort on equal footing so that you can then eventually kind of get to those bigger goals as a union, which is what I appreciate with what uh, I think achieved with the Titmouse New York contract, and really making a point of making sure that trying to get production as up to par as possible, so that when you do renegotiate, you can kind of all come in together and be like, okay, well, now we can focus on like the overall wages or something. And I feel like oftentimes union members tend to think the opposite, and they're like, oh no, we got to focus on the big picture here, like let's get the wage. And I'm like, oh no, like these people over here are suffering like they don't even have like a living wage. Like, let's kind of maybe fix that, and then we can get to this bigger picture all together in a much stronger place.
Yeah. Power in numbers, you know? Yeah. I was the biggest thing that I think we got out of the contract was what we won for production workers, because again, like, you're living in New York and you're getting $800 a week. That's just unsustainable. You can only have so many roommates.
Yeah.
You know. CG Bird F, I'm gonna say that because I don't know how to pronounce it, says, would love to see IATSE in stop motion. Me too, CG. And if you're working in stop motion, check out the Animation Guild's website and contact an organizer over there. Actually, you can hit up Ben Spate. He's here in the chat. But yeah, totally agree. So we're talking about, again, like gender equity, gender inclusion. I found an IGDA, which is the International Game Developers Association survey. They said that 63% of workers in games are male, with 31% that identify as female. And that's still a large chunk, you know?
Yeah, that's pretty close to animation, at least the numbers I last saw.
Yeah. So I think it's a very similar kind of landscape where we're trying to navigate the immense amount of people who are working in games or want to work in games that are underrepresented and need to be brought into these roles to make games that are also more diverse, and animation that's also more diverse, like just media that's more diverse. Because that's super important to making good stuff, you know?
Right. Yeah.
But yeah. So what are we doing for preparing for your upcoming negotiations now? Like, what are y'all's tasks list? Like, don't tell me what you're trying to negotiate for, because that's top secret, but you know.
Well, we formed a committee of active members who want to participate in our negotiations. And so we're in the process of like kind of researching proposals and kind of surveying the membership about priorities, and then training, even like, you know, what is like collective bargaining for people who are completely new to it. For those of us in the committee, we're having regularly like weekly meetings. There's even like weekly subcommittee meetings. So if I mean, obviously that's depending on everyone's level of like involvement. I guess something to watch for actually is right now we're trying to come up with a new kind of campaign slogan. So, you know, last time around it was New Deal for Animation. So now we're kind of talking about like, well, what should we do this time? What should it be about? so pretty soon, I guess once you see that messaging, then you'll know that we figured it out.
I can't wait. I want that shirt too. If y'all didn't see the equal pay for equal paint shirts that the color design committee put out, are you wearing it right now? Oh, look at that. Look at that swag. It's beautiful. I love it so much. It's such a nice shirt. But I will wear whatever new slogan proudly. Y'all put out a great shirt. But yeah, so there's like, it's a lot different because last week we had Pat White from the education department join and talk about negotiating a first contract. So it's a lot different when you're revisiting, especially because you also, as a large local, you all have about 6,000 members, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of different interests and a lot of different job classifications that might have specific needs to address. I mean, we did like a very small version of that for the titmouse contract. We had proposal committees like focused on very specific proposals that we were talking about, to kind of like get folks who were most interested in like certain priority issues to get more involved with that process. But that's more like proposal based and less job classification based, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I guess I haven't had the experience of negotiating a new, like, newly organized contract. I've only dealt with the master agreement negotiations. It, yeah, my impression is that once you get terms in writing, it is very difficult to get significant changes. Like you can, budget a little bit, but yeah, I mean, I guess that first contract does like is important because it kind of starts. I mean, I don't want to say necessarily sets everything in stone, but it's a pretty hard kind of line that kind of is drawn, and there's a lot of effort to kind of move that line. Because one reality also with negotiations is like we're kind of fighting the employers to simply keep what we have, because like they would prefer to take what we have away. So like, we're on one side like we want this better, and the studios are like, can we like get rid of that? And so that's why it seems like it's like we're kind of always in the same place, because yeah, it's very hard to kind of budge further once you've kind of made that first contract. That's part of why we called that our last negotiating campaign New Deal for Animation, because like we just so many terms felt outdated, like because they just been there since like literally like the 1940s. Like, like, can we finally change this baby? But yeah, it takes so much effort to do that.
Yeah, even just a word.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you'll argue about a word for weeks.
Yeah, I think that was one thing. Like we had to negotiate that the pronouns change or like I don't know, be formatted. Because back in the day, the Animation Guild contract, I think it only used male pronouns. So literally any change you want to make, you do have to talk to the employer about it in negotiations.
Yeah, it's wild to even think that language would be very specifically he or his or him, but in very old contracts it's still there, which is why again we renegotiate every few years, because these things are important, even semantics.
Just something we did for the color designers actually, because
Yeah.
the job was originally known as color stylist. And it was kind of just something we discussed in our committee meetings of like, does that make sense? And people would say like, oh, when I try and look for color stylist jobs, I get hairstylist recommendations. And kind of the more, at least I thought about it, I was like, it kind of seems like only female dominated jobs use the term stylist. Like that's like, why is that? Like, and it just so happens that hairstylists are also fighting for pay equity, because in the local that they're represented by, they have the hairstylist and the makeup artist, and historically the makeup artists were actually male dominated.
Really?
So they have a higher paying rate, but the hairstylist is a female dominated job and they have a lower paying rate. And it just makes you think of like, why are they even called stylists? Like, why weren't they called hair artists, like the makeup artists? And it just, to me, there's just this subtle thing of like the language we use kind of diminishing women's work. Is like, yeah, it is different. Like, we're not going to call you designer. We're calling you stylist. And so that's why we felt it was important to change the title of the job to color designer, so that it could just kind of get the ball, like the idea planted in people's heads of like, yes, this is actually design work and should be valued like design work. It's not like less than. So yeah, I'm always on top of people because I still see today people refer to it as color styling. I'm like, no, that we changed that. the proper term now is color designer. Please use that. We
Yeah.
went to the effort of to negotiate it, so please use it.
Yeah. Um, I'm glad that I found out about color design when that had already changed. So, like,
That's
we
good.
didn't
Yeah.
really do that in New York for a long time. Like, we were kind of just like animation, like, design stuff was always done in LA. Um, but now, over the years, the more of that shift of the animation itself being outsourced, more color design work has come to New York. So I hadn't even really heard of it called any other way, but that's just because my experience is different on a different coast.
Well, no, I mean that's yeah. I mean, honestly, yeah. When I saw what y'all gained for the Titmouse crew and the fact that color designer was listed as color designer and listed like with the design, like that's literally everything I've ever wanted for our master agreement. Like I'm like copy paste, like yes please, like so yeah. And to me it showed like you all were negotiating on the present day circuit, like this was yeah, it's equal, like this is how we operate, it's color designer. Whereas we've, because of dealing with a pre-existing contract that has so much baggage of history, like we're kind of like having to like pull the employers and be like, no, like let's talk about 2024, like we're no longer in the 1940s.
Yeah.
um yeah, so that's what we've been doing, and so we're gonna go through it again this summer.
Yep.
So
Every three
get
years.
further. Yeah.
Um, well, Teri, it has been amazing having you here. I'm so glad that you could make it and that we were able to set this up. Um, thank you to everybody in the chat for being here. Teri, do you have any parting words for the audience today?
Um, yeah, I mean, if you're interested in, gaining union representation, like don't be afraid, like make that first step, and there's organizers here to help, guide you. Whereas for me, I didn't, and yet I still, like, I don't know, we managed to make it happen. So, like, you don't have to be so, I guess, yeah, there's a lot of intimidation I know around it. And fear, but I personally have, at least I don't think I've experienced any like negative repercussions or negative effects by being so involved with the union and vocal. I think if anything I've experienced the opposite, or I actually have only seen positive kind of things come to me by being so involved with the union.
I think that is a remarkable thing, and also something that we should definitely talk about in a future stream. I know Maggie in the chat has a very similar experience as well, like talking about why speaking up and forming unions and organizing is not detrimental to your career. I think it's super important. But that's a discussion for another day.
Oh, I see in the chat, Crystal is there. We do have the Animation Guild is going to be hosting very soon a free portfolio review day. So, the animation, they just posted it on their social media, so you can look there for information to sign up if you'd like to get a professional review by an Animation Guild member.
Yeah, and you don't have to be a guild member to get your portfolio reviewed.
Yeah, anyone can sign up.
Hell yeah. You can sign up there at theanimationguild.org or check them out on Instagram at theanimationguild. Also, if you scan this QR code, that'll take you to our link up top site that has our FAQ document. It's got our zine. It's got a link to this Twitch. It's got a link to our YouTube. It's got a link to our GDC Vault panel video that you can check out. And it's also got a link to gameworkers.org, which is a place for you to go to get in touch with me if you would like, or you could just reach out to me, cfellmeth at iatse.net. But yeah, start a union today. There is no better time than today. Tomorrow is tomorrow, but just get started today and you'll soon be negotiating your first contract. But again, Teri, amazing having you. I'll be back next week. Same time, same place. Different person. And we'll talk more then. I hope everybody has a wonderful week. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye, y'all.